Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. After having secured our own food security, I think we can look towards the global food security also. Think about a situation where price of food suddenly goes up by 60–70% within a few months. We may be able to afford food, but what happens to those in Africa, in South Asia, and Southeast Asia and Latin America? That's an issue which is very critical, and for many people in this world is a life and death question at that time. But more for the policy makers, what to do, and that creates a sort of a panic situation. And here is something wonderful on the table, a long-drawn research into the political economy, how different countries reacted to that, and whether they improved the situation or worsened the situation, and what are the lessons that we can learn if the next price spike takes place. I think we are most fortunate here to have Professor Pinstrup-Andersen, World Food Prize laureate, who has worked a long time. He's the only World Food Prize laureate in policy, agriculture policy. I think all others are perhaps breeders and implementers of many other things. So we look forward to listening to this laborious work that he has done on 16 countries. And then we are grateful that our great colleague, friend, if I may say so, now Padam Shri, Dr. Bibek Debroy, who is a member of the National Institution for Transforming India, NITI, the new name of Planning Commission, is here to launch this book. We are also grateful to Prabhu Pingali, professor at Cornell, also former president of International Association of Agriculture. Now, he had a number of avatars, I think, from Gates Foundation to Lee to all those. The CVs are in your files, right in the folders you can have. We are looking forward to a good, lively discussion, and the way I think we would like to proceed is first I'll request Dr. Rajat Kathuria, who is the director and CEO of ICRIER here, to formally welcome all of you, what ICRIER has been doing in some of these areas, and then Dr. Tarp, who is the director of the UNU-WIDER. He will give his perspective. Then we'll request Professor Debroy to launch the book, and then Professor Pinstrup-Andersen will give a 20-minute presentation of what this book is, what are the findings, and what we can learn out of this. And then maybe I can come, Professor Bibek Debroy will give some remarks on that. And then later on the India case, if the time permits, we will have something where I will pitch in, and Prabhu will say everything is wrong what you have done. Thank you. Could I invite Rajat to formally welcome?
Thank you, Professor Gulati. Let me add my echo of welcome to all of you. Very warm welcome to this evening's discussion on a book launch that we at ICRIER are extremely proud to host, along with UNU-WIDER and the India Habitat Center, Delhi, with whom we have an ongoing collaboration in another area of research that we're doing on urbanization. So it's indeed a great pleasure to welcome all of you to this book launch. Dr. Finn Tarp, Dr. Bibek Debroy, Dr. Pinstrup-Andersen, Professor Prabhu, Pingali, and of course, our own Infosys chair, Ashok Gulati. It's an absolute pleasure to have all of you here. As Professor Gulati said, this is an issue that has been occupying a lot of mind space of the policymakers in India. One spike and you have all kinds of reactions at the policy level, at the domestic level, at the international trade level, and it affects not only the quantity but the prices and therefore also the distribution, which is extremely important for us in India, the distribution of food stocks across population which may not be very wealthy to be able to afford the spikes. So I think this is an extremely important area of policy. We spent a lot of time in ICRIER, as Dr. Gulati was saying. We've spent a lot of time in ICRIER working on agriculture. Our agriculture work has now taken off to another level. We have Professor Hoda sitting here, who I think all of you know, who's been working in agriculture in ICRIER for a number of years. For those of you who know ICRIER, you know that we work on policy. We've been working on various aspects of policy, trying to provide informed evidence in agriculture, in trade, in urbanization, and climate change, so that we can enable the policymakers to take more informed decisions, and of course to discuss and discourse the recommendations that we make. In this specific area, there are a number of ongoing studies, and I would encourage you, those of you who are interested, to please go to our website and have a look at the nature of the work, the kind of work that we are doing. It is very intensive, both in secondary data as well as in primary data. As Professor Gulati referred to, we have a project on buffer stocking and what the implications of that for our domestic policy are. And as you know, the spike that happened in 2007, and then when India went, buffer stocks had come down to an all-time low, and then we entered the international market for wheat, and the prices went up, and there was a reaction in our domestic prices as well in our MSPs. Those of you who are familiar with that would know, and it created, so today we have food stocks, and ICRIER and Professor Ashok Gulati has been recommending that we should take a conscious decision to take forward-looking decisions on what to do with those food stocks that we've collected, because they have carrying costs as well, and if we liquidate them, they could have impact on prices. That is one of the recommendations that have been made by ICRIER and by a committee that is headed by, that was a committee not headed by Professor Gulati, but he was a part of that committee. We've also been working on a project on competitiveness of Indian agriculture. We worked on a project on the impact of climate change on agriculture, and looked at what the impact of climate change would be on production of various crops as well as dairy, and what are the corresponding mitigation and especially adaptation policies that we can take in order to address the impact of climate change. The impact of climate change in agriculture can be very severe, and I think we've been recommending that we should start taking action now, apart from the fact that we need to take action on climate change for a number of other reasons, but also for production of agricultural crops reasons. We should also begin to kind of internalize in our policy issues relating to climate change. Then there are some other projects that we work on in the periphery. As you can see, ICRIER's research on agriculture is fairly rich. We also work on food processing. We also work, or we're hoping to work on agriculture value chains, and hopefully at some point on GM crops as well. Since last year, Professor Gulati has taken over as our Infosys chair on agriculture, and we are hoping that with the team that we have, which is going to be led by Professor Gulati, our work on agriculture would become even more meaningful, even more relevant, and even more internalized in the decision-making process of policymakers in agriculture. As I don't need to tell this audience how important agriculture is to the Indian economy, and it supports almost 50% of our workforce, and that's something we need to address. So agriculture needs to become more competitive. we need to begin to do more processing in agriculture, and we need to actually begin to increase our production of crops, or high-value crops as well. All of this is under the research program that, under the Infosys chair, is being headed by Professor Ashok Gulati. So, with these words, I welcome all of you once again to this book launch. I'm extremely delighted that Dr. Pinstrup-Andersen, the World Food Laureate and Professor at Cornell University, is going to spend time with us discussing the intense and rich work that he has done in this book, which is Food Price Policy in an Era of Market Instability, a Political Economy Analysis. With those words, I once again welcome all of you, and I hope that you have a very rich and engaging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. It's really both an honor and a privilege for me to be here today to co-host and witness the book launch that is going to take place today. Thank you for joining, and thank you very much to the special guest today. We appreciate very much you being here with us, sharing experiences and insights. Thank you very much to Rajat for co-hosting. We appreciate very much. You've been doing all the hard work. The rest of us are just sort of basically be on a free ride. We appreciate that very much. But thank you also to Ashok. And if I may say, first time I met Prabhu was actually on my home base at the University of Copenhagen, where he gave a very inspiring lecture. So I'm looking forward to what you have to say today. It won't be that inspiring? I'm sure that's going to be wrong. But then, of course, thank you also very much to Per Pinstrup. And let me say here that Per and I happened to grow up 15 kilometers in distance from each other, but Per was ahead of me, so he's always sort of been a little bit like this sort of famous older brother that you really look up to. And that has continued throughout my professional life as well. He's sort of been this sort of really very famous and very important person. And I was delighted when we were formulating the 2010-13 UNU-WIDER work program, where we identified what we referred to as the triple crisis: the finance, the food, and the climate change. And we discussed a lot how these areas are interlinked, how these three areas have very often been treated in separate silos. But it became increasingly obvious that they are not separate from each other. And then Per accepted to work with us on the food part. And for that, I really am very grateful. And Per has, with his very big experience, been inspiring us at UNU-WIDER. He has been playing a key role of bringing the team together that has been contributing in this book, because I think it's important to stress that this is actually a global team of researchers that have engaged doing different country studies from which we are now trying to learn lessons. Because by 2009, I mean, prices had already started to drop down a bit again. So we'd seen this sort of very significant spike, and then sort of it sliding down again. But I want to say something that has been with me for more than 30 years. I actually started working with FAO in 1978 in the aftermath of the world food crisis at the time. Then followed many years where sort of it seemed as if the food problem was kind of going away, not in an absolute sense, but sort of prices seemed to be falling. There were hopes that this was going to be relatively okay, and then certainly this spike hit. Now, that's going to happen again. We're not at the end of these food spikes. They're going to happen again. So one question that stayed with us as we formulated the work program is, what is it that drives policymakers? What makes them take the decisions that they take in order to become informed about what might be a good idea, both to research, but also to advise as we move forward? So this sort of trying to understand this, I believe, is critically important in terms of formulating appropriate advice, because volatility and spikes are going to happen again. So this motivated us, and we very much appreciate that Per took the challenge of working with us. UNU-WIDER is a small institute as an institute. We are actually only about, well, now 15 researchers, but the importance of the wider institution is it's actually a global network. At any one point in time, WIDER has somewhere between 250 and 300 researchers on different types of contracts. And our relationship with India has been there from the very beginning, from 30 years ago. And I wish to say today that I hope that I can, as strongly as I can, communicate that we do want a strong, continued relationship with India. We think it's important that an institute such as UNU-WIDER, which is an independent UN institute, can work with researchers in India, trying to formulate independent advice, independent research that hopefully can help inform the global policy debate about important issues. Now, we don't push any specific agenda. We are not there to push particular projects or particular lines of argument. We are there to help provide a platform. We are there to help stimulate innovative research that can hopefully make people think and promote change in the development economics profession and in the policy making whenever required. And we are willing also to challenge established wisdom if we believe that it is required. But we are a very broad set of people working together, as I mentioned, at any one point in time, somewhere between 250, 300 people. And just before I came, I was happy to be able to recruit 2 young, absolutely brilliant Indian researchers to be part of the team. So I'm hoping that that will help reinforce our collaboration. It's nice to be here today. It's an important book that's being launched. It's, as far as we're concerned, a starting point for thinking about these issues. And may I say that as we are now moving forward, the next work program we are now starting to implement is a program on transformation, on inclusion, and on sustainability. There's 3 pillars of work, but we will also then be continuing an emphasis on addressing African development issues, because this is still where one of the important challenges lies, while we're concerned, but we are a global institute. We draw on experiences from across the globe. We will also be addressing issues of development finance, and importantly, we will try step by step to see whether we can contribute to research on gender in line with our focus on inclusion. But why is today's presentation and launch important? It is because the majority of the poor people in the world are still in the agricultural sector. So what researchers and policymakers do in relation to agriculture and food is essential for the majority of the world's population. There can be no bigger and more important task to think about that and try to get that right. Because if we get that right, we will then be promoting a better world. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate very much your presence.
Wonderful to be back in Delhi and to interact with so many colleagues and friends. Thank you for organizing this, Ashok. Thank you, Dr. Kathuria, for hosting this effort or this get-together. Ashok, of course, is part of this study, so it's not as though he did me a favor, because we're in this together with a whole bunch of other people. This was a team effort. There were researchers from 14 developing countries, from the EU, from the US. We had collaboration with a number of organizations, but it was really a triple collaborative arrangement with Cornell University, with UNU-WIDER, and with Copenhagen University. This shows the 14 participating countries. I know you probably aren't fast enough to jot that down, but that will be, of course, in the book that will be available as soon as Oxford University Press releases it formally. We had, as I mentioned, work done in the European Union and in the United States. Now, the justification for this study has already been mentioned by previous speakers. we as policy advisors, as policy analysts and others involved in understanding policy have to understand the policy process. We have to understand why policymakers make the decisions they make. When I grew up as an economist, I frequently heard the term that there's nothing you can't predict how politicians are going to respond or behave because they're not rational. That is not true. If we don't think they are rational, it's because we don't understand their goals and we don't understand why they are making the decisions they are making. But they are making decisions on the basis of the evidence they have, on the goals they have, on what they can manage to get into the policy process. We need to understand what are the factors that come together in that policy process. What are some of the lobby groups, some of the interest groups, some of the stakeholder groups, whatever term you want to use. What's the relative power of these groups and what's their agenda? If we don't understand that, we as economists advising governments or pretending to advise governments are likely to be wrong in many cases. So the 2007-2008 food price volatility that continued 2011 and 12, and we now on a downward slope, provided a natural experiment for trying to understand not only how governments responded to these food price fluctuations, but also why. And that's why we invited researchers from these countries that I'm showing here to come together in a team. We met as a team 3 times. We developed a methodology together. We interacted together. We learned from each other. It was a fascinating experience, and the results are on the UNU-WIDER website, and a summary of the results is in the book that we are launching, we just launched today. So the first question is, to what extent were these price fluctuations, this price volatility in the world market transmitted to domestic markets? Was it really relevant for the food market in Nigeria or in Bangladesh or somewhere else? So we looked at the transmission, and what we found was basically 3 different groups of countries in terms of the way the prices were transmitted. And I'll just illustrate those 3 groups, but of course all the countries are discussed in the book. This shows the wheat prices in the world market compared to South African wheat prices and Bangladesh wheat prices. You see a tremendous correlation, very high price transmission. Now look at this one, which shows the rice prices in the world market compared to the rice prices in the Chinese and the Indian domestic market. In China and India, as you know better than me, I'm sure, the rice prices basically continued on a smooth upward trend in the case of India, and to a lesser extent in the case of China, while the world market price took a tremendous increase. The rice prices basically doubled over a 7 to 8 month period. That was barely visible in these 2 markets that we're looking at. The third kind of country, and I'm illustrating that for maize prices in Malawi and Zambia, those are landlocked countries. Those countries have very large food price fluctuations, much larger than what we saw in the world market, but the 2 sets of fluctuations were not correlated very highly. So in terms of transmitting food prices from the world market to those countries, there was a very low transmission. On the average, if you think an average is useful, which I doubt, about 1/3 of the fluctuations in world food prices are transmitted to developing countries, but that average covers the spectrum from 0 to 100%. This shows the transmission between the world market price and the prices in the European Union. The yellow graph shows the FAO food price index. The blue one shows what happened to producer prices in the EU, and the I'm not sure what color that is, but let's call it red for the sake of argument, shows the prices to consumers. Now note that the prices to consumers didn't increase by more than about 5%, while the prices went up dramatically in the world market. Who were complaining about prices going up in the supermarkets? We were in the European Union, yet there was only a very small increase. Now, one of the reasons why there's very little correlation between, or very little price transmission, if you like, between what happened in the world market and what happened in the EU is that we are dealing with different commodities in these indices. The weights are very different. The FAO Food Price Index is weighted by the quantity of selected commodities traded. The indices in the EU are weighted very, very differently. So we have to be real careful with the various indices applied out of the context. And I'm illustrating that in this slide, which shows cereal prices in the EU and in the world market. And here you see a tremendous correlation, almost 100% transmission. So we have to get our commodities straight. We have to know exactly what these indices mean before we can draw conclusions. Now, let me move to policy responses, because I only have 20 minutes to cover this book of 700 pages, so if I'm talking fast, I apologize. There are basically two kinds of policy responses, two options that governments pursued. Trying to decouple world prices or world market prices and domestic prices. That's what India did in the case of rice, that's what China did in the case of rice. Or secondly, compensate the groups that the government didn't want to lose. Let me rephrase that. Compensate the losers as identified by those in charge. India did, of course, both of these. So what are some of the policy interventions to decouple world market and domestic prices? Trade policies to reduce price transmission. Again, that's what was done in this country, that's what was done in China and in some of the other countries. You could introduce an export ban, for example, or export restrictions in order to keep domestic prices from increasing along with world market prices. Direct price control was tried in some countries, mostly some of the African countries. They didn't last very long, they were not effective, they could not be enforced over a very long period of time. It doesn't take economics 101 to figure out that direct price controls that are not part of changing demand and supply are almost impossible to enforce. And in fact, that's what the countries found out. When prices went up, some of the countries removed the value-added taxes on food in order to slow the increase in food prices. That, of course, had an effect to the extent that they had a value-added tax to begin with. Short-term supply management, some countries released grain from the stock, from the public stock. There was some of that in some of the countries. Production expansions, not really. It takes a long time to expand food production. You certainly can't do it within a season, and it really didn't have much effect. And as soon as the prices dropped, as they did beginning in 2008, and then again about a year ago, they came back down again. Governments kind of forgot about the need to invest in agriculture. In some countries, they actually remembered, such as Ethiopia, and in most other countries, they just went back to the complacency that we saw at the end of the last century. Compensation, there are basically three things we found: targeted cash transfers, targeted or untargeted food subsidies, and increased public sector wages. I'm going to come back and talk a bit more about the targeting part. But let me talk now a bit about the policy process and the consequences. Most of the policy interventions that were made in those 14 countries in response to the increasing food price volatility, most of those were ad hoc. They mostly came in very late in the game. Sometimes they had the opposite effect of what was intended, because They were trying to deal with increasing prices at a period after the prices had begun to come down. Very high fiscal costs, revenues lost from, if you put an export ban in place and you normally have export taxes, well, you lose the revenues. You take the import tariffs away. If you are a net importer, in order not to have quite so high food prices, you lose the revenue. And if you eliminate the value-added taxes, you lose the revenue as well. Program costs, the transfer programs are not free. As you well know, in this country, food subsidies are not free, so there were huge program costs. And those programs, in fact, were very short-lived in most countries. Most countries that introduced them in response to the food price volatility got rid of them very quickly. Other countries maintained them, such as this country. Egypt, for example, is well known for its large food subsidies, but they were there before the so-called food crisis, and they survived to a considerable extent. Most countries interfered with price signals, even those countries that provided compensation to certain population groups. There is a tendency, I believe, that among most governments, not to trust the market, so we've got to interfere because we know better what the prices should be, we meaning the government. In most cases, they're probably wrong, because by interfering in the prices, of course, and I'll come back to that in the recommendations, you are not sending the right signals to producers or consumers as to what they should, how they should change their behavior. This doesn't mean governments shouldn't intervene, it means they have to do it very, very carefully. Another policy process question was the targeting. Most of the targeting was very poor, in the sense that it wasn't necessarily targeted on the poorest of the poor. What we found in several countries was that the transfer programs were targeted to the lower middle class in urban areas, even though the poorest of the poor were net buyers of food in rural areas and therefore suffered the most. The reason was obvious. The government was concerned about the lower middle class taking to the streets or paying somebody to demonstrate in the street and smash some windows and burn some cars or whatever else they do when they're out there, whereas the rural poor were less likely to be a threat to the government's existence. They had transfer programs, they had social safety nets. Food and fertilizer subsidies is very interesting, I guess we shouldn't be surprised. But many countries would prefer fertilizer subsidies to investment in agricultural research. Why? Because the fertilizer subsidies would have an impact in the next growing season, whereas agricultural research might have an impact 10 or 20 years from now. So fertilizer subsidies was a favorite topic in a number of countries. Some countries, of course, have had fertilizer subsidies for a long time, with or without food price fluctuations, but others had actually introduced them. They didn't keep them for very long because they were too expensive. We didn't make much of an effort to get to the bottom of corruption simply because the network participants, the researchers who did the work, would like to stay in their country after the project was completed. And it was, of course, as you can imagine, a very sensitive issue. So we really did not do a structured analysis, neither could we do a structured analysis of corruption. We had lots of, how should I put it, empirical evidence that corruption was going on, but we really don't have much to say about that, for obvious reasons. Those countries who tried to use trade policy to control the domestic prices, to break, if you like, the transition from the world market to the domestic market, many of those countries saw illegal cross-border trading, and therefore the trade policies were not nearly as effective as they had hoped. Some countries had selective enforcement of export bans. If you're my friend, I will export to you, but if you're not, I will claim an export ban. And I won't mention any countries that did that because that might get me in trouble in this country. Untimely government procurement. Some of the governments actually procured grain from the domestic market at the time the prices were going up. That, of course, would push up prices even further. The reason, as we understand it, the reason is that there were concerns that prices would continue to go up, so better procure now than tomorrow when the prices are even higher. Some countries, such as the Philippines, would go into the global market, to the world market, and import much more than they needed, than they would normally have done at that particular time, because they were worried that food prices were going to continue to go up. Some international organizations contributed to this by saying food prices are going to continue to go up. Some advocacy groups were saying this is the end of food as we know it. From now on, food prices will continue to go up. As soon as in the middle of 2008, the food prices began to go down, all of these people said nothing. And this goes for the news media as well. The news media amplified, exaggerated these issues dramatically. And I'm not talking about India because I don't know what the news media did in India, but generally speaking, there were so many illustrations of the news media saying food prices are never going to come back down, they're going to continue to go up. And of course that scared policymakers who are responsible for feeding or for making sure that they get re-elected, I guess was really the issue. So what are some of the political economy lessons? Most of the governments that we work with claimed that their overriding goal was to improve food security for the poor. But in fact, their priority goal was to maintain their own legitimacy. Is that a new finding? Not really, but we do have more evidence now to show that whatever they did, priority number one could be very different from the rhetoric of what they actually said. A very serious issue is that when push comes to shove, a government has to look after its own people before it worries about its neighbors. And we had a tremendous amount of beggar-thy-neighbor policies taking place in order to protect your own people. And that is logical, and if you are elected or appointed by a certain group, you're looking after that group. The problem is that if we are to have orderly trade, for example, we may have to sacrifice in one country in order for other countries not to be a lot worse off. So there was a lot of this kind of pursuing domestic policies irrespective of international consequences, and the WTO apparently was rather not very helpful, rather couldn't really deal with that. When I was a student, I was told that governments are unitary decision-making units, unitary decision-making groups. They make a decision and they all agree on it and everything is beautiful. In fact, what we found was the exact opposite. That governments consist of a number of units that compete among themselves, a lot of conflicting arguments taking place. And that's one of the reasons why the policy interventions were very late, because there was so much debate and so much disagreement, for example, between the Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Finance or whatever advocacy groups could influence them. So government decisions are an outcome of a very messy process, and we need to understand that process. In most cases, there was no policy innovation. Governments pursued what they had pursued in the past, and remember that for most of those countries, the price fluctuations for food were nothing new. What was new was that we now had this tremendous fluctuation in the world market, and that hit the newspapers and the media around the world. Whereas countries such as Malawi and Ethiopia have very large food price fluctuations, if not every season, every year, then over a period of 4 or 5 years, they would have spikes and troughs. So they were basically implementing some of the same policies they've been using in the past. The relative power stakeholder groups varied. In a couple of countries, Brazil and South Africa, for example, there were groups of large farmers who had rather a lot of control over what happened to policies. In other countries, the floor millers were very powerful. Consumers were powerful mostly by threatening violence. There weren't a whole lot of organized consumer groups except for those who were threatening to take to the streets. Increasing urban bias. When, as I mentioned earlier, when it came to targeting transfer programs or compensatory schemes, governments were looking to the urban areas because that's where the threat came from. There were a couple of countries that behaved differently, and this is one of them, and China is another, because in those two countries, the rural areas do have a very large political influence. In addition to claiming that the governments were after improved food security, most of them also said, we are in favor of strengthening smallholder agriculture. And then they turned right around and did whatever they could do to facilitate large-scale agricultural production. There was very little actual action following the rhetoric to help smallholder farmers. Now remember, this is a short time span, and you have to be careful drawing conclusions for the longer period of time. Something we did not expect to find was a tremendous mistrust between the public sector and the private sector. And that was in virtually every country. The government would hold back its decrees or its decisions, its new legislation until the last minute, and then they would release it, and the private sector had no chance to prepare for it. Similarly, on the private sector side, they would hold back the information that the government could use, for example, on hoarding, on stockpiling, or on whatever they were planning to do next. Another thing we didn't expect to find was that the foreign agencies, including the UN agencies, the major donors and so on, had very little influence on what happened in the countries during that period of time. This is very different from the period of structural adjustment that some of you may remember, when the governments were pretty much directed or pushed to make certain changes. In this particular case, the donors and the UN and other organizations, the development banks and so on, were pretty much following what the governments wanted to do, which the only explanation I can give for that is that here there wasn't a big loan that had to be repaid, and therefore it was less important that the governments behaved the way the donors wanted them to. Let me end by talking about the recommendations. And keep in mind that these are not recommendations for India. I've only been in India since yesterday, and I'm still an expert. I'm not confused by facts. So whatever I say here, if it's relevant for India, that's wonderful, but that's not what I'm here to talk about. The recommendations we get out of this. First, protect the price signals. Let the market work. If prices go up, make sure the farmers know, because there will be a response. Make sure the consumers know there will be a response. If prices go down, the opposite will occur. Emphasize targeted compensation over price interventions, basically for the same reason. Because if you don't let the prices do its job, then of course you will never get the response you need in order, for example, to produce more when prices are high. All of the groups in the food chain, in the food system, need better risk management tools. Whether we're talking about producers, traders, or consumers, governments need to help establish those risk management tools. Going back to the question of letting the prices do what it's good at, we should seek high level of price transmission. Now that may be impossible for a national government to accept, but at least we should be moving in that direction so that when prices go up, there will be a supply response as well as a consumer demand response. And that goes along with the argument that we should have low levels of trade restrictions. One of the key recommendations that comes out of this work, as well as much of the other work that I have been involved in, is governments need to invest in improved rural infrastructure. Smallholder farmers, and for that matter any farmers, are constrained by the lack of effectively operating domestic markets, whether it's for inputs or outputs. They need access to electricity, they need access to water, they need access to inputs at reasonable prices, they need better institutions. We from outside tend to focus on improving the farm. We're going to teach the farmer how to do better. And you know what? If that farmer is in a straitjacket because the markets don't work, there's no access to inputs, there's no access to credit, there's no access to the electricity and water and so on, there isn't a whole lot that smallholder farmer can do. So this is just confirming what, in a sense, we're finding in many other studies. Now, the price transmission I've talked about so far is from the world market to the domestic market. But in fact, we also have a price transmission problem within the value chain in a given country for a given commodity. So we need to help governments improve efficiency in the supply chain so that the difference between what the primary producer gets and what the consumer pays can be reduced. The blending mandate that we have in the United States and the European Union requires oil companies to mix, whether it's diesel or gasoline, with a certain amount of biofuel, independent of the price of the raw material. So in the United States, you are siphoning off the top of the maize market or the soy market a certain quantity that is necessary to meet the blending mandate, independent of what the price is. That's not a good idea. We need to make the demand for raw material that competes with food price sensitive. So if the prices go up, the oil companies will buy less. If the prices go down, the oil companies would buy more. That is not what Washington is ready to move towards at this point, but it seems like this is one of the reasons why prices fluctuate for these commodities, and I'm talking primarily about maize and soybeans right now, because we're siphoning off a certain quantity irrespective of the price. I'm worried about the behavior of some of the traditional exporters. When prices went up, in order to protect the domestic prices to domestic consumers, they put in place either export bans, I already discussed that, or export restrictions, which hurt a number of other countries. That is not what I call orderly trade, yet WTO was created to try to provide for orderly trade. Yet WTO was helpless in this case because what is written in the documents isn't sufficient to make sure that the exporters behave at a reasonable level. My last point is on the public-private collaboration. As I mentioned, there's a lot of mistrust, and wouldn't it be nice if we could somehow turn that into trust? It is above my pay grade to tell you how to do that, but I think if we are serious about a private sector-driven economic growth, and I presume we're all interested in that, because the alternative doesn't seem to have worked. We have to make sure that the public sector does its job on the public goods creation, such as infrastructure, and the private sector does its job in terms of following up with processing and trading and all of the things that need to be done. If you haven't had enough here are two sources where you can get lots of details. The first one is the book that was just launched, and the second one is the WIDER website where you can download everything for free. There's a lot more detail on that. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think I've overspent my 20 minutes, and I apologize. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So you have put a lot of challenges and advice to the governments. May I request Dr. Bibek Debroy, most of you know him as a member of the VP, but very few may know that he is one of the very prolific Twitter in Sanskrit. So the knowledge that he has from the Vedas and Upanishads, that's something unique.
Dr. Pinstrup-Andersen, his younger brother, Dr. Tarp, Professor Pingali, Rajat, Ashok, and ladies and gentlemen. Since Ashok has decided to embarrass me a little bit, let me also embarrass him by telling those of you who do not know that Ashok has also been awarded the Padma Shri this year. It's always a good opportunity to be invited as a chief guest because it sort of goads you into reading a book. And increasingly, since I have donned my new hat, I have discovered that all kinds of people in all kinds of different places have decided that I have now vested with wisdom, and therefore I get invited to be chief guests across a diverse range of topics about which I know precious little. So therefore I'm going to be very brief and limited in my comments so that I don't squeeze Ashok and Professor Pingali from talking about India, because I live and work on India, and therefore together with most of you, our interest will primarily be on what all of this means for Indian policy formulation. But let me step back a bit and, as I said, state it almost in bullet terms. Bullet number one is Indian agriculture is riddled with distortions and interventions. It's a complete myth that Indian agriculture has in any sense been touched by liberalization. It has not been touched by liberalization on the output side, which Ashok himself writes a lot about, but it's also not been touched by liberalization on the input side. It's not been touched by liberalization on the public expenditure side. It's not been touched by liberalization on the decentralization side. It's not been touched by liberalization in the sense that government policy still builds artificial silos between agriculture on the one side and, let's say, rural development on the other. Consequently, we have not had the requisite commercialization, diversification, except in instances where they have happened despite government policy. So that's bullet number one. Bullet number two is a sweeping generalization, and this is a sweeping generalization for the sake of provoking you, which is if you leave aside some agricultural items, before you liberalize, before you globalize, whatever the expression is, Indian domestic prices of agro products, if you leave aside some commodities, were lower than global prices before the recent spike. And on the manufacturing side, Indian prices of manufactured products were higher than global prices. If If you accept that proposition, assuming you liberalize, however impartially, you would expect those prices to move together. So therefore, as Indian citizens, where we laud the fact that in real terms the prices of manufactured products have come down, why on earth should we deplore the fact that we as consumers are paying higher prices for agro products? That's the way it ought to be. Bullet number 3, of course, is this very elusive term called food. So far as the government is concerned, food essentially means rice and wheat. Food isn't rice and wheat. And many of the spikes, at least in recent months, in food items, have not been in rice and wheat, they have been in fruits and vegetables. Which leads me to a fourth bulleted point, which again is meant to be provocative, which is part of the problem with the rationality of policymakers, is the presumption that the Indian farmer is stupid. The Indian industrialist is not stupid, so you can allow him or her to make his or her decisions. But the farmer is stupid, and the farmer, therefore, must be controlled in terms of government policy. Be it production, be it inputs, be it distribution, all of that. Now I happen to think that's absolutely stupid, but that control mindset pervades all reactions to government policy. I think the next bulleted point is, given this mess that I have described, and this mess has been there except for a little bit of tinkering here and there since 1991, given this mess, what would you expect to happen if there is an external shock? Or to put it differently, what does liberalization and globalization do? However you choose to define it, and liberalization is not simply trade policy. Trade policy is only a little bit of it. You've got that agenda for liberalization. What happens to price volatility if you liberalize? That's the moot question, including something like forward markets. I happen to think that if you actually liberalize, it cushions against volatility. Unfortunately, I don't think most policymakers, and I don't think most media believes that. Most media, who provide the ammunition for the policymakers to adopt their positions, actually believe that if you liberalize, it increases volatility. And I think this is an important issue. The next point, therefore, is we now suddenly had this spike. And this spike occurred against the backdrop of a situation where, by and large, in India, because the reforms had not happened, the production of most agro products was inelastic, and simultaneously, because of income growth and consumption growth, the demand was going up. So there was an underlying trend of an increase in food prices in any case. And on the top of it, you had this. Did this external spike now reinforce and trigger the movement towards liberalization as it should have? It did not. I have not read the book, I have not read Ashok's book, Ashok's chapter yet, but from what I have gathered, in terms of my reading the newspapers, the essential Indian policy has been a knee-jerk one of control, of using trade policy to control exports and to some extent liberalize imports, and both exports and imports on the agricultural side tend to be completely ad hoc, often driven by motives. Should I say this wearing a Niti Aayog hat? Maybe I should. Often driven by motives of arbitrage opportunities. So therefore, not the arbitrage part, therefore I think we should learn a little bit from Ashok and Professor Pingali on what all of this has meant for Indian policy, so that we probably liberalize before the next spike, because when the next spike happens, history tells us we are not going to liberalize. So if we are going to liberalize, we'd better do it before the next spike. Thank you again very much for inviting me.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Bibek Debroy, on that note. I have been asked that I should not take more than 6 or 7 minutes on India, and then Prabhu has to say his thing on the overall. I want to take you to 2006-07. We imported about 6 million tons of wheat in this country after a long period. And 2007, in September, 3 great personalities visit this country. First was the Director General of FAO, and he had a meeting with the Prime Minister. He was talking around what is happening to the global prices, and headlines in the newspapers were, these prices which are rising are going to stay there for the next 10 years, high global prices. Second, Director General of IFPRI had come. I was a witness to that meeting with the Prime Minister, and we had a 45-minute session with the PM, and as we were ending, PM asked, Dr. Joachim, what do you think where the world prices are going to go? And the answer was, next 10 years, in all probability, the world prices are going to be high. Third person who came, Jeffrey Sachs. Same thing, public lectures, media, big, and meetings with the PM. So think about if you are in a situation where you had just imported 6 million tons, you are a little nervous on the rising prices globally, and somebody tells you, oh, you are going to be exporting more of rice, when your own people at home may have to suffer. So the reaction was, first try to restrict the exports of rice and wheat by putting minimum export prices higher, but that did not work. And within the next 2-3 months, we implemented export ban. Now I can imagine the spike globally. We were exporting rice at that time, and the cabinet decided to put an export ban. 2007-08, as Pierre rightly said, our cereal inflation was 5 point something, less than 6%. Globally, the price of wheat and rice had gone to more than 60%, 100%. But we became a little nervous. So ad hoc decision. Now, if the transmission was allowed, and after India put export bans, many other countries started on the track, 1, 2, 3. We had Vietnam, we had Thailand, and all this sort of clamor and a bit of nervousness started. Without those export bans, and the world prices of rice, for example, could have gone to maybe $500, $600, $700, but they went through the roof to $1,000, which created bigger panic. Then in 2007, we also set up, this is the other part of the story now. How did India react to create a supply response and look at the distribution side? National Food Security Mission was set up so that we have to get, in the next 5 years, 20 million tons of extra food. Minimum support prices were increased next year by 20%. So price incentive was given. And if you look at 5 years what had happened, we produced not 20 million tons of extra food grains, but 42 million tons of extra food grains. Good price incentives, push towards supply response, and exports were banned. From 2007 to 11, exports were banned. And your target of increasing 20 million tons shot to 42 million tons. What would have happened? you accumulated all reserves with the government. In 2006, our reserves were 21 million tons. In 2012, 1st of June, it touched 82 million tons. We didn't have a place to keep. The whole capacity in the country was half of that, and food was, as usual, you know. I joined the government in March 1st, 2011, and when I worked out, I said, my heavens, there is a crisis of plenty already on our head. And I wrote a note, the highest level, that minimum 15-20 million tons of food grains must be liquidated, exported, or whatever you do. I remember the chairman of the Food Corporation of India came to my room and he said, Ashok, you are coming from outside with all these wild suggestions. If the government allows even 1 million ton to go out, I'll give you a treat in a 5-star hotel. So I said, all right, sir, let's work on that. We worked strong, and this is how inside those different bodies of the government work. Food Ministry wanted to keep everything with them. Agriculture Ministry wanted to open up. Finance wanted to open up. Commerce wanted to open up. And you have to fight in the system. Finally, willy-nilly, October 2011, we opened up. And look at what happened in 12-13 and 13-14. The 2 years total, India exported 43 million tons of cereals from the country. 43 million tons together in 12-13 and 13-14, which it had never done in the last 3,000 years of written history. Now, if that had not gone, you can imagine the cost of that stocking policy. And out of that excessive stock holding came the distribution policy, the National Food Security Act, that we need to give to the poor at 1 rupee, 2 rupee, 3 rupees. That is the 2030 Act. So what do we learn out of this? It's going to be expensive if we don't allow the opening up system. Even if it was a spike and a crisis in 2007, there could have been an export control, fine, but can we put some sort of a law in place that every 6 months it needs to be reviewed? The situation, I mean, you put an export control and for 4 years literally you forget. And how much it is costing the nation, the economic inefficiency, that is the big question. I think there has to be a quarterly or 6 monthly review of that situation, because in 2008 middle, prices internationally collapsed. And as Per rightly said, all these experts did not say a word. Why the prices went down when they were saying for 10 years they will stay away. And then 2011 again the spike came. So there is a lot we need to, as professionals, need to understand what was happening. And there are several theories, I don't have the time to go into that. But the lesson that at least I learned, one, this panic and ad hoc, and many a times whether the political economy was of these international institutions who wanted more funding to create a scare in the system that food is going to be very scarce and there could be starvation at a large scale. Because from 75 to 2000, real prices had come down, and most of the international players who were funding agriculture, they had more or less moved away. So they wanted back those donors and those players on the table, but maybe the political economy. But at home, I overall see that India was able to protect its, but if the transmission, as you rightly said, there was hardly any transmission in India at that time. But over 3 years, 4 years, if you look at the prices and the MSPs that were raised, gradually our prices touched. So it may not be in those 5-6 months, but over 3 years, 4 years, you see that India came up to the trend of the global prices. So with these words, I think there is a lot to learn on the Indian case story. The full chapter is right there. It is a heavy cost that we have already borne because of the abrupt export controls. I think we need to get somewhat more liberal, as you rightly said, allowing both sides Today we are the biggest exporter of rice, but we have an import duty of more than 70%. So, doesn't gel. Let the rice come from Myanmar if it can feed the northeast, but we are taking rice from Punjab to the northeast. Now, there are a lot of things through trade policy, how you can, with more open trade policies, you can augment your food security. And if you want to protect the poor, instead of giving physically, because the cost of handling that system is very high, it's better to move towards income policy rather than through subsidized prices. It leads to much greater inefficiency in the system. I would stop here and request Prabhu to say everything that we did right or wrong.
First of all, let me congratulate Pinstrup-Andersen for this great piece of work that's been put together, and Ashok for his chapter on India, which was not surprising, really sharp, strong chapter. I have a relationship to this book. I'm not an author of the book in any way, but I was at the Gates Foundation when the idea of this book was conceived. And so along with UN-WIDER, the Gates Foundation was a proud co-sponsor of the book, and I had the privilege of signing the check from the foundation for the book itself. So I'm glad to be here at the launch, not in that capacity because I'm no longer at the Gates Foundation, but at least from a historical point of view, to be here. It's after such a long session of so many great speeches and following Ashok, I'm not quite sure what else I can say here. So I just make a few very brief comments. The first comment I want to make is it's really time for us to look seriously at how we in India define food security. For too long, food security has been defined and continues to mean food self-sufficiency. And essentially self-sufficiency of rice and wheat. And that's been the way in which much of the discussion on food security has happened in India and continues to happen in India, and the Food Security Bill continues to push the staple grain self-sufficiency and provision of staple grain agenda and not go beyond that. Now, when you think about the 1960s, when you think about the 1970s, that made a lot of sense. To say we are massively deficit in food grains, we need to do something about it, and therefore the Green Revolution and all of that happened. But today we're in a really peculiar situation of having adequate access to food grains, but being among the top nations in terms of incidence of malnutrition. Incidence of malnutrition among the poor and among the rural poor and among the urban poor. And this problem of malnutrition has very little to do today with access to food grains. It has to do with the fact that we don't have access to a balanced diet, and we have very poor access to micronutrient-rich food. Poor access to vegetables, fruits, dairy products, livestock products, etc. And therefore today, we still are a country, despite the growth, with the highest levels of child malnutrition anywhere in the world. And that's something we need to worry about. And as we think about what this book means to us, we need to look at not food security in terms of staple grain self-sufficiency, but rather think about nutrition security. And to think about what is it that we need for a balanced diet and how do we provide for that balanced diet towards future crises. Because the amount of emotion that went into talking about the rice price and the wheat price and how do we respond to it, no one talks about the fact that the relative prices of vegetables have always been much higher. And access to vegetables has always been a problem. It doesn't have the same political economy bite that staple grains seem to have. And that's where I think we need to look more carefully. Second, we are also a country where obesity levels are rising dramatically. Obesity level among the middle class populations and beyond the middle class populations. And here again, the idea of bringing in improved access to better nutrition is an important priority at the country level. And better access to vegetables, fruit, etc. Even for middle class populations today, even in urban areas, the value chains around these crops are so poorly developed that the relative prices of these commodities are much, much higher compared to staple grains. And even where populations want to diversify their diets, you do see significant problems in improving access to the diversity of diets. So, my message is very simple. My message is, as we look ahead, we need to look at what are the opportunities for diversification of food supply systems in India, with a view to enhancing overall nutrition security, both for the poor and for the middle class population in this country. And how do we do that? What are the opportunities for doing that? I suspect, as we think about that, the very first thing we need to do is we need to level the playing field in terms of policy support that's given for agriculture. The policy support that's given to the main staples, rice and wheat, is significantly higher than any support given to other commodities. And one needs to level that in terms of price policy, in terms of input support, credit policy, and agriculture R&D. The extent of agriculture R&D support that goes to just rice, wheat, and maize compared to all other commodities is just significantly skewed. And one needs to look at ways in which you shift that R&D budgets towards a more balanced diet and balanced food supply system. So I think that's one big priority we need to look at. The second priority, and Ashok has alluded to this, Ashok has talked about it, and that's the entire PDS system and the reform of the PDS system. As long as you have a PDS system that's committed to providing rice and wheat, then you can't blame the government for trying to produce as much rice and wheat as it can to feed into the PDS system. But that system, despite all of the issues around it, is not going to help enhance overall nutrition security. And so if you think in a nutrition security point of view, one needs to look at a very different PDS system and a very different procurement system. And yes, looking at cash-based systems as a significant alternative to what we've got today. And as you think about diversification of food supply systems, one also needs to look at how do you enhance overall farmer responsiveness to diversification. Investments in markets, investments in overall infrastructure, cold storage systems, investments in quality control, safety standards, etc. And finding ways in which we can link smallholders, small farmers into value chains are an important part of what we need to do. And we still have a problem in India today where we don't have a way in which smallholders can integrate into the value chain. The restrictions around it, the transactions costs around linking into value chains are very, very high. And the ability to move horticulture product, vegetable products across geographic areas is highly restricted, etc. There's a lot that one can do in this area, and we need to figure out how to move forward in this. My last comment, there's a lot of talk that happened after the food price crisis about global governance of food stocks, about how maybe there should be some way in which one can manage food stocks at a regional level, at a global level, and that way we can avoid having countries have their own stocks, manage their own stocks, etc. That conversation has been going on and it continues to go on. I was the director of economics at FAO for several years and been very much involved in this discussion about global governance. But from my years in FAO, I learned very clearly local politics always trumps global governance. And when it comes to food prices, And when it comes to potential impact of food prices on the poor, and potential riots that can happen, and consequences for governments, no government will favor a global system relative to taking care of their own people. So that's something one needs to think about also. But one needs to think about some of the ways in which one can improve global market signals, and investing in better information systems that allows us to get a better handle on what market prices are like in different countries and at the global level, what the stocks are like in different countries, etc., can go a long way towards helping remove some of the uncertainties in market signals and allow us to be much more rational in our decision-making process. With that, thank you so much.